Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about an HOA that made a big mistake. It all began about a year ago when I received a couple of emails from my Home Away from Home's Homeowners Association. The emails sounded benign enough at first glance. Vague mentions of updated HOA policies and reorganized leadership structures, things that under normal circumstances I might have brushed off as typical HOA jargon. But there was a strange undertone to them too. Something that made me just a bit uneasy, even though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why at the time. I've owned 2 properties for the better part of 6 years. My main residence is in a quiet suburban town, and my second home, a cozy A-frame cabin perched near a scenic ridge, sits about a 2-hour drive away. I bought the mountain place to escape the grind whenever I needed a break, to recharge with some fresh air and postcard views of ancient pines. It wasn't remote enough to require off-grid living, but it was far enough removed from large urban centers that I usually had to bring my own groceries, plan my water usage carefully, and keep a mental log of local wildlife that might rummage through my trash bins at night. Over time, I got very comfortable with that balance, and I loved every minute spent up there. The HOA for that mountain community was typically mild. When I purchased the cabin, all they really did was maintain some communal hiking trails, manage snow removal in common areas, and oversee the private roads connecting the various cabins on the ridge. Their fees were not extravagant, and the board members back then seemed pleasant, if not a bit scattered at times. If there were big changes afoot, I usually got a letter in the mail or a notice posted at the community board near the main hiking trailhead. I even met a couple of the board members at a neighbor's barbecue one summer, and they seemed welcoming enough. Ex-rangers, retired teachers, folks who wanted to preserve the natural beauty of the place. So fast forward to when I started receiving these cryptic emails. They mentioned urgent matters, but were never explicit about what exactly was so urgent. Thinking it was yet another set of rules about bear-proof trash cans or an event announcement I didn't care to attend, I left them unread for a bit. I confess, I was busy with a hectic project at work, plus dealing with a sick relative. The cabin was the last thing on my mind. I planned to go up in a couple of months anyway, so I figured I'd just handle whatever needed attention when I arrived. That assumption proved to be a huge mistake. One day, out of the blue, I decided to log into my county's property appraiser website for an entirely separate reason. I was double-checking a boundary line for a potential sale of a different property. Imagine my shock when I realized that my mountain cabin was no longer listed under my name. It wasn't just mislabeled or delayed in the system. It was outright categorized as belonging to the HOA. I blinked, thinking this must be a glitch. At first, I even considered the possibility that I had clicked on the wrong parcel number. But no, the address was unmistakably mine, the one on that winding forest road I knew like the back of my hand. Panic set in, and I immediately called the county's property records department. They informed me that there had been a foreclosure carried out by my homeowners association due to delinquent HOA fees and covenant violations that apparently reached such an amount that the HOA took possession of the property through the legal process. I almost choked on my own breath. Not only was I up to date on all HOA dues, but I hadn't received a single legitimate notice. Everything always auto-drafted from a dedicated account I'd set up just for property expenses. How on earth could I be delinquent? Worse yet, that cryptic email from the HOA had recently changed from urgent to final notice, or so the county official indicated. The official told me that by the time they recorded the foreclosure deed, it was effectively the end of the line. I was reeling. How was that possible without any real mail, any actual phone call, or at least a formal notice pinned to my front door? There was no way this was above board. I decided to drive out to the cabin that very weekend, ignoring my original plan to wait a couple more months. In the meantime, I tried calling the contact numbers I had for the HOA, but they went straight to voicemail or gave me endless runarounds. At last, I got hold of someone named Veronica, someone I had never heard of before. She calmly insisted the board had mailed multiple notices to my property address, and that they had also emailed me regarding escalating fees I supposedly owed. I started to ask what fees those were, and she rattled off an impossibly large sum of money. She quoted an amount in the tens of thousands, but the standard monthly dues were only a few hundred, and I'd never once missed a payment. Not to mention, There had never been any mention of fines or additional levies for covenant violations in all the years I owned the property. I demanded Veronica explain these so-called violations. Her response was cold. Overdue structural changes that did not receive prior approval. She couldn't specify further, so I pressed. After a few moments of me refusing to let her off the hook, she claimed that my building had been illegally expanded and that I had constructed fencing around the property that violated the color scheme mandated by the HOA. Now, mind you, my A-frame was exactly how I bought it, a 1.5-story structure that had been in that shape for decades, and my fence was a simple wooden perimeter that matched the rest of the local design. Nothing had changed, so their claims were baseless and easily disprovable. But the fact that they were even attempting this line of reasoning was a huge red flag. When I arrived at my cabin, I found something that made my blood boil: a different padlock on the door, and no trespassing signs hammered into the ground around the property. There were fresh footprints in the dirt leading up and down my porch, and every window was shuttered in a manner suggesting someone had come by to thoroughly check the premises. I called the local sheriff's office to see if I could get a deputy to meet me there, because I feared that if I tried to break in, I could be accused of trespassing on my own land that was apparently no longer recognized as mine in public records. The deputy who arrived was kind but somewhat perplexed. He recognized me from a prior event, a community meeting about trail safety. He verified my ID, listened to me recount how I discovered this shocking foreclosure, and sympathetically said there wasn't much he could do except take down a formal complaint. He clarified that, from a property record standpoint, I was basically in limbo until I proved the foreclosure was either fraudulent or reversed by a court. I could, however, file a police report about possible fraud, which is precisely what I did, though I was worried about how far that might go. On top of that, it turned out the HOA had re-registered with the county under a new leadership team. They had apparently replaced the old board members with a brand new group that included a professional property management company. That company, from what I gleaned, was known for being quite ruthless with fees and foreclosures in other communities. If you typed their name into any search engine, you'd find horror stories of homeowners losing their properties over minor mistakes, claims that the management company had used unscrupulous law firms, even stories about forged signatures. I felt my stomach churn, wondering if I was the next victim of a large-scale fraud. My friend recommended a HOA and real estate litigation attorney, so I hired him right away after returning home. Call him Bradley. Bradley was blunt. If a HOA violates foreclosure laws, the entire action can be overturned. It gave me hope. The bigger issue was proving that the HOA had not given me notice and had invented these violations. My attorney received the foreclosure paperwork from the county, and to my horror, it showed that the HOA had filed legal documents, including pictures of a new wing I had built without permission, and an unapproved fence. The photos showed a smaller, tan-colored structure instead of my pine green cabin. The pictures show a chain-link fence, but my fence was wooden. It was insane. The entire file was full of obvious errors, but they pushed it through the system because they assumed I wouldn't notice. Maybe they thought I was a part-timer who wouldn't understand the process. Their guess was wrong. My attorney discovered that the management company had also charged late fees for monthly dues that had been unpaid for over a year. But none of those matched my bank records. HOA fees were always drafted on time in my auto-pay statements. It appeared that someone in the new HOA administration forged or mishandled records. We discovered that local mail forwarding was altered. They claimed to send notices to addresses other than mine, keeping me in the dark. This was becoming a fraud labyrinth. I met Stan, an older mountain community neighbor who had a similar eerie story as we dug deeper. Stan almost lost his place when the same property management group claimed he owed thousands in special assessments for road maintenance. But Stan had canceled checks proving he had paid every assessment. They lost that evidence when he tried to bring it to the board. Stan stopped the foreclosure by filing an injunction before the sale. He also faced litigation. I heard more about outrageous fees, shady new board members, and forged signatures on official documents from other neighbors. This seemed like a broad conspiracy by the HOA's new leadership to steal valuable mountain properties at low prices and resell them or do something else for a profit. Bradley and I decided to attack. We challenged the foreclosure, claiming fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, due process violation, and everything else my lawyer thought would stick. We also invited other owners with bizarre foreclosures to join. 5 others joined me in suing, but I led the way since my foreclosure had already been recorded. In the meantime, the sheriff's office transferred my fraud complaint to a county financial crimes unit. They investigated board members individually. They also examined management company internal communications. Anonymous emails or phone calls from insiders or whistleblowers were sometimes received. One tip led me to a new board member with an embezzlement conviction in another state. A disbarred attorney gave the HOA legal advice on forging documents. This was becoming beyond twisted, like a crime drama. We needed a court order to physically reclaim my cabin, even though we had a strong legal case. For 6 months, I was locked out of my home, which stressed me out. Every time I looked at pictures of my place, where I had spent holidays, proposed to my now ex-partner, and had so many memories, it felt surreal that it was no longer mine. Bradley forced the HOA's law firm to turn over communications about my property's alleged violations during discovery. In one email chain, a property management company representative told the board president that the parcel at my address looks ripe for the picking if we can churn out the usual documents quickly. We rarely get pushback because the owner is absent. Let's expedite this and finalize by next quarter. That email phrase was almost an admission of malicious intent, confirming our suspicions that they were targeting absentee owners to foreclose quickly. The smoking gun was yet to come. Another tech-savvy neighbor recorded the board president, Gavin, talking with a few board members after a community meeting. Gavin boasted about easy foreclosure on another property, using generic photos of code violations from another site. In that conversation, the management company promised to take care of any loose ends at the county records office. The suspicious neighbor discreetly recorded the entire conversation using his phone's voice memo feature. That recording destroyed the board's good faith claims once he gave it to the legal team. When the civil trial began, the HOA board's attorney argued many technicalities. They claimed we missed deadlines, had unclean hands, and provided pictures from a different time period. Motions flew around, making it messy. After hearing the mass of contradictory evidence, the forged photos and that email about ripe for the picking, the judge saw our compelling case. The judge was appalled by their brazenness and warned that if these allegations were true, this went beyond a civil matter. It crossed into criminal territory: real estate fraud, document forgery, possibly conspiracy. Financial crimes investigators continued their investigation alongside the civil suit. Over time, they discovered that the property management company was systematically identifying properties in multiple counties' HOAs. They'd manipulate internal accounting to make an owner delinquent, inflate fines, and speed up foreclosure. They sometimes worked with unscrupulous attorneys to force these cases without notifying owners. Quite a noise. Investigators claimed that HOA board members who cooperated would receive a cut of the profits when the property was resold. We also found a secondary scheme. After foreclosure, the board or management company would rent the property on short-term rental websites and pocket the money until they found a buyer at a below-market price. Without the receipts, I wouldn't believe it. They listed my cabin, my refuge, on several online vacation rental platforms. That gall was insane. They used photos from inside the cabin, pictures I recognized from the listing when I bought the place, to advertise the charming mountain hideaway. So not only was my property stolen, but it was also being rented out to clueless vacationers who had no idea it belonged to someone else. The day that was revealed, I was furious. Bradley insisted we include conversion, for renting my place, and any other relevant tort. We were also informing the local DA, who was increasingly interested in prosecuting board members. We saw the board members at one hearing. Some looked defiant, others nervous. Board President Gavin sneered at me like I was a nuisance, thinking he'd get away with it. That changed quickly when the evidence avalanche fell. A lesser board member, likely seeing the jig was up, flipped. He gave the DA's team emails, memos, and spreadsheets showing board members' expected earnings from property flips. The spreadsheet had columns for target property, projected foreclosure cost, resale value, profit margin, and kickback to board. My cabin was listed for a lot more than the delinquent fees. The courtroom's meltdown when those documents were presented was almost comical. Their lawyer desperately tried to block the evidence on technical grounds, but the judge allowed it because it showed the board's mental state and potential fraud conspiracy. After months of correspondence, depositions, and hearings, the judge decided to rule on my civil case against the HOA. I was emotional today. I spent so much time, money, and mental energy on something I never thought would happen. The judge declared the foreclosure void from the start. I needed the property back immediately. The management company and some board members of the HOA were found liable for significant damages. I later learned from my attorney that it was one of the largest damage awards in a homeowner versus HOA lawsuit in that region. The judge referred the case to the DA for criminal prosecution, stating that the forgery's brazenness and depth warranted serious legal consequences. The criminal hammer fell then. Using the whistleblower's documents and the civil case record, the DA charged multiple board members. Gavin, who was so smug, was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering after they found shell accounts. I learned that Veronica, the woman I called, forged HOA communications. That got her charged. As the legal net closed, some made plea deals to reduce their sentences, but others went to trial. They received multiple felony convictions. The final hearing saw them all receive prison sentences, from a few years for the minor conspirators to nearly a decade for Gavin, the ringmaster. The property management company collapsed after officers were indicted and it went bankrupt. A highlight of the ordeal was returning to my mountain cabin with the new keys. I hired a locksmith to remove the fake lock. I entered expecting the interior to be trashed, but it was mostly intact, if dusty. The biggest changes were that my belongings had been searched and some furniture had been moved to accommodate renters. The tall pine trees, the stream in the distance, and the view out that front window reminded me that I was back home. I felt relieved, like reclaiming a stolen part of myself. Not everything was perfect. The legal battle was costly, but the damages compensated me. Some neighbors lost a lot of money trying to fix the mess. Some developed heart problems from stress. I became close friends with some of them over the ordeal. In the months that followed, we met several times to celebrate the legal victory and set up a new, legitimate HOA structure led by honest community volunteers who cared about the neighborhood and environment. We voted to tighten oversight on any future management company, requiring community approval for major changes, preventing board members from acting unilaterally, and requiring annual audits of all financial statements. It was also important to remember that the justice system worked, albeit with great effort and resources. Local officials initially dismissed our allegations, but law enforcement took them seriously after we provided proof. My story taught me and others that you need to pay attention to your property's status and the people who may be in charge, even if it's just a small cabin you visit occasionally. If you're not vigilant, unscrupulous people will exploit your absence. Another highlight is the personal cost. I had nightmares about losing my home, opening the door to find it stripped bare or finding strangers living in it who wouldn't let me in. The importance of home to our well-being is astounding. When threatened, you feel vulnerable that's hard to shake. Those fears faded, but it took time to heal after the legal victory. I spent more weekends at the cabin, sometimes sitting on the porch with coffee, listening to the pine's wind and thinking about how close I came to losing everything. I felt grateful each time for the chance to be there and call it mine. The new HOA structure developed in the months following the verdict. We renamed the association and filed new documents with the county to avoid confusion with the disgraced organization. We made it clear in the bylaws that foreclosure was a last resort, requiring multiple good faith attempts at resolution and official sign-offs at each step, including certified mail notice to all homeowner addresses. We learned that transparency and communication matter. We never want property owners to claim they were blindsided or unscrupulous management groups to hide behind covenant language. Victimized owners also profited from that civil suit. After attorney fees, some of the settlement went to cabin owners who spent a lot to keep or recover them. Some owners used the funds to paint or upgrade their plumbing. The community was reviving as if everyone was trying to make the best of a bad situation. In unexpected ways, we formed deeper bonds. We invited local wildlife experts or hiking clubs to appreciate the natural beauty that drew us to that ridge. Stan, the neighbor who nearly lost his property, became a local hero. He had lived up there quietly for decades, but after the fiasco, he became an informal archivist. He meticulously recorded everything: court documents, photographs, testimonies, local news articles, to explain the new rules to future residents. Stan said, "If we don't remember this properly, we'll be doomed to let it happen again." His extensive records helped us push for statewide HOA reforms. To prevent similar fraud in other communities, Some local representatives met with us. The new leadership of our association was transparent and honest, but they had a steep climb. Trust had to be restored. Some longtime owners resisted centralization. The HOA had been used to steal homes, after all. However, the new board members' sincerity won them over. At monthly meetings, they read financial statements, showed expenditure line items, and took questions. We discussed road repair budgets, heavy snowfall preparation, and social events. The community felt closer than ever. Despite these positive results, I still remembered the old board and shady management company trying to foreclose on me. A local journalist asked me to do a scandal expose. I agreed if they respected some people's privacy. The journalist interviewed Stan, me, and others to warn about HOA abuse. The article spread and even prompted legislators to hold HOA oversight forums. I didn't like the publicity, but I thought people should learn from it. If my story could save someone from their nightmare, it was worth it. In the aftermath, I still occasionally received calls from unknown numbers that ended in silence, as if someone was listening. Bradley thought it might be a former board member or indicted management company employee still resentful. But none of those calls took off. The ringleaders were imprisoned by the law. Life went on after the calls stopped. At the cabin, raccoons in the trash and choosing annual flowers for the driveway are my biggest problems. A calmer life. This entire experience taught me the value of vigilance. Though you may think you're good with your HOA or local property laws, you never know what's going on. My best advice for property owners, especially those with second homes or HOAs, is to check their records regularly. Check your mail and email notices, verify your payments, and investigate any suspicious activity immediately. My initial unease at receiving those cryptic emails was a sign I ignored, and I could have avoided months of suffering if I had acted sooner. I'm glad I caught it early instead of letting it go for years. Another part of me appreciates the thorough justice. I got my property back and saw our community change from a lax, trusting group of owners to a more active, engaged, and supportive one. People who once waved politely from across the street now discuss how to keep the area clean, keep the new HOA board on track, and defend ourselves from unscrupulous actors. Of course, seeing the guilty parties defend their greed and deceit before a judge and being sentenced to prison was poetic justice. I loved seeing the wealthy and cunning pay for their actions in a world where they seemed to get away with it. It didn't fix the stress or damage they caused, but it reaffirmed my belief that wrongdoing is punished. The day I received the final restitution check from the defendants who hadn't been bankrupted or indicted was unforgettable. A symbolic moment. Many nights were spent worrying about losing the cabin and how this fiasco would ruin me financially. The check wasn't a profit. Most of it went to legal fees and repairs, but it showed they had been held accountable. I will never forget closing my hand around that paper and realizing the perpetrators were finally paying up, literally and figuratively. Given the stress, some friends asked why I didn't sell the property afterward. The cabin was too important to me. I wouldn't let swindlers keep me from my retreat. The whole ordeal strengthened my attachment to the place. It now symbolizes perseverance. Every time I step on that porch, I remember how I nearly lost something I love, fought to get it back, and helped my neighbors. The pine-scented air smells sweeter now, perhaps because I didn't let greed or fraud take what was mine. After the fiasco, life has mostly resumed. I still visit the cabin, sometimes for weeks when work allows it, or just for a weekend if I'm bored in the city. This neighborhood is friendlier and united. Our summer activities include bonfire potlucks and group hikes. For those who can't shovel, we organize rotating shifts in winter. A true community. The new board even creates watchdog committees, volunteer oversight groups that review the association's finances and legal compliance to avoid blind trust. It's crazy that the old board and their accomplices thought they could quietly foreclose on my cabin without me knowing. Did they think a property owner wouldn't realize they'd been robbed? They may have given their history. They conned the wrong person. When I saw that official record listing the HOA as my property owner, I was ready to fight in court. I wouldn't let them steal a place I worked hard for and treasured. I told a few co-workers about this fraud, and they're always shocked by how extreme and brazen it was. Some wondered if HOAs could foreclose, unaware that many states allow foreclosure of HOA dues and special assessments. It's legal if the HOA follows the law and the homeowner is delinquent. The problem is that unscrupulous people can use it for extortion or theft. These management companies exploit the fact that many owners don't know their rights or assume everything is fine if they're on autopay. making them terrifying. I and my friends were woken up by this. Learning about other communities outside our region that had similar management company problems was intriguing. We found class action lawsuits in multiple states, families evicted without notice, and elderly residents scrambling for legal aid. I was lucky because I found the problem quickly, could afford a good attorney, and found neighbors willing to help. If the management company had targeted isolated, financially strapped, or overseas owners, the story might have ended much darker. Despite our success in bringing the criminals to justice, I worry about the countless others who may have fallen victim to the same fraud and never fought back. I testified at a state HOA reform hearing near the end of the legal process. I detailed how the new board and shady management firm conspired to take my home, forging documents, lying about code violations, and upsetting everything. I saw legislators' disbelief, horror, and resolve. We started a government conversation, but whether they pass stronger legislation is unclear. After my testimony, an official said, "I'm sorry you had to go through this, but thank you for bringing this to our attention. We need to work harder." I felt grateful. This fiasco may lead to changes that protect others, not just personal vindication. It turns out this story is about unchecked authority as well as real estate fraud. It warns us about the consequences of complacency about property rights and financial transactions. Being informed, standing up for yourself, and never underestimating the possibility that people will do almost anything for money if they can get away with it, were all lessons from my experience. The scandal is nearly extinguished. The guilty paid the price. The community rebuilt a better system from the ruins. I still feel good when I unlock my cabin door and step inside after defeating the scoundrels who tried to take it. In a strange way, my quiet weekends there make me appreciate them more because they remind me that justice can prevail, even after a long fight. Naturally, I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. If it happens, I hope my story can inspire resistance. Gather evidence, find allies, fight in court, and never give up until the truth emerges. Corrupt elements died that way. I'm still confused that they thought I wouldn't notice one of my 2 homes disappearing from my name. They paid dearly for their arrogance, as I noted. This chapter of my life has taught me about community, law, and resilience despite the drama, heartbreak, and unbelievably stressful nights. I now fiercely defend my rights. When I wake up on a crisp mountain morning with sunlight peeking through the pines, I take a deep breath and remind myself that every struggle can be overcome with determination, evidence, and a refusal to give in to bullies. Instead, they were jailed. Friends, thank you. See you soon.